My name is Anne Wertheim. On behalf of the John Adams Institute, which is the organizer behind the lecture series American Literature Today and American Focus, I would like to welcome Anna Quindlen and Christine Remmerechts to Amsterdam. This is your first visit to Amsterdam, Ms. Quindlen, and I hope Amsterdam answers to all your expectations. Before I pass the microphone to Flemish author and literary critic Christine Remmerechts, who will hold a short introduction, I would like to thank publishing house Atlas for their participation. Most of you present here tonight are aware that the John Adams Institute is a non-profit institution and can only keep up the high standard of its lecture series through cooperation with publishing houses, donations from corporations and individuals. At 9 o'clock there will be an intermission. After intermission, Ms. Remmerechts will lead a discussion with Ms. Quindlen and take questions from the audience. There is a microphone in the aisle. It's in the left aisle. And if you prefer, you can hand in written questions during intermission and leave it at the book desk. I will now give the floor to Christine Remmerechts and hope you enjoy your evening.
Yes, good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Anna Quindlen, who, in the words of one journalist, is the US's #1 having it all woman. But I somehow feel that Anna Quindlen must hate that phrase by now, but there it is. It seems unavoidable when one is talking about Anna Quindlen, but I'm sure that she'll want to comment on it later on. For the time being, here is how Anna Quindlen earned herself that epithet. And I quote, "She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, an uncompromising mother of 3, and now the author of a novel that has hit the raw nerve of a nation." Anna Quindlen, welcome to Amsterdam. The novel mentioned in the quote is One True Thing, Anna Quindlen's second novel, published in '94. Her first novel was published in '91 and is called Object Lessons, but we are here today to celebrate the publication of her latest novel's Dutch translation, Black and Blue. A novel whose topic I would like to link to a recent article in the English newspaper The Guardian. I quote, "In England and Wales, 2 women every week are killed by their partners, past or present." Black and Blue's heroine, Franny, narrowly escapes getting killed by her husband, but has to pay a very high price for that escape. She relinquishes her identity, her past, her job, and her beautiful home as she assumes a new identity. In practice, this means that she has to start from scratch and can never refer to her past nor get in touch with former friends or colleagues, nor even with her beloved sister. Her plight reminds me of the life of a spy who has to assume a totally new identity in order to infiltrate enemies' ranks. But obviously, whereas spies usually opt for such an existence of their own free will, Franny has had little choice. Either she was going to be battered to death, or she had to leave her home and her life as it was. She will have to pay a higher price still, but I feel I shouldn't disclose what that price will be, since a lot of the novel's tension hinges on that development. You simply sense, as a reader, that things are bound to go seriously wrong. The husband, after all, is a New York cop, and so together with Franny, you constantly sit on the edge of your seat as you fear that her hiding place is about to be discovered. And there is a very real temptation to go and read the closing pages of the novel long before you get there, because the tension is almost unbearable. I must confess that that is exactly what I did, but you shouldn't resort to such childish behavior. It seems a bit awkward to discuss an author's life and work in her presence, since obviously she's in a much better position to do so, and will do so too in a moment's time. I would just like to briefly do two things. In the first place, I will give you some factual information concerning Anna Quindlen's indeed extraordinarily successful life and career. Secondly, I would like to give you some good reasons for reading her. Basically, there seems to be two amazing facts about Quindlen's career. The first is that she managed to carve a prominent place for herself at a largely male-dominated New York Times, and then packed it all in order to have more time with her children and to write fiction, of course. At 28, she was writing her own column for the New York Times, and I understand that was a pretty remarkable and exceptional achievement for someone that young. But she resigned from the paper when her second child was born. She then was offered an opportunity to write a column from her home. The New York Times, they are making a most uncharacteristic effort to accommodate a working mother's needs. Quindlen left the Times again in 1988 after the birth of her third child, then was lured back in 1990 with a place on the op-ed page. Significantly, her column was called Public and Private. She was the only female voice made a point of addressing traditionally considered women's issues, won the Pulitzer Prize, yet left the Times again in 1994 to become a full-time novelist. Inevitably, phrases that keep coming up in articles about her are the already mentioned have-it-all superwoman and a feminist who cherishes traditional domestic values. Why should we read Anna Quindlen? Why should you read her? In the first place, Anna Quindlen has a knack for writing books that offer a good read. None of her books are obscure or unnecessarily complicated. It seems to me, and now I'm speaking for her, and I may therefore actually be saying rather silly things, but it seems to me that Anna Quindlen is driven by a desire to communicate with her readers. Here is a woman who has seen a lot, thought a lot, read a lot, and experienced a lot, and has found in the novel the ideal format to develop her views. It seems to me that Quindlen articulates issues, emotions, feelings we can easily recognize and identify with. Issues such as, what does it mean to be a daughter, a father, a mother, a friend, a lover, a wife? In One True Thing, Ellen, very much her father's daughter, goes home to look after her mother, who is dying of cancer, and in the process discovers that she is also her mother's daughter. For the first time in her life, she's consulting recipe books, hoovering, cooking, baking. To her surprise, she finds she has always seriously underestimated her mother's intellectual capacities. Her mother, it transpires, has some very shrewd views on the classics from Austen to Tolstoy. In other words, Ellen learns that one shouldn't pigeonhole people. Significantly, Ellen's mother objects to the way women characters are being pigeonholed by their authors. Either they are the heart or they are the mind. If they are the heart, they are brainless. If they are the mind, they are heartless. Why should there be such a choice? Anna Quindlen has a marvelous gift for exploring some of the starker aspects of life without ever becoming gloomy. For all the pain and suffering in her work, there is also hope and optimism, probably caused by the fact that her women characters are surprisingly resilient. Moreover, in their darkest hour, there always seems to be a woman friend by their side who helps them make it through the night. Indeed, you could read, I think, her work as a tribute to female bonding, the powerful ties between a mother and her daughter, between two sisters, between women friends. True friendship can and does make all the difference in Quindlen's work, as it does in real life. Anna Quindlen.
Well, the Southern writer Eudora Welty once wrote, "Novels and stories always will be put down little by little out of personal feeling and personal beliefs, arrived at alone and at first hand over a period of time is needed. To go outside and beat the drum is only to interrupt, and so finally to forget and to lose. Fiction has and must keep a private address. For the 3 years since I left the New York Times, I've been avoiding the blandishments of various people who have tried to get me to leave my private address and do more public things. But even I was not able to avoid the blandishments of coming to Amsterdam for the first time to give this lecture tonight, to an utterly charming city where, despite many best efforts, I have not yet been hit by a bicycle. Little did I know that I would also have the opportunity to do something that I rarely have the opportunity to do, and that was to hear an accomplished writer and an incisive critic talk about my work in a way that made it very clear that she had read it thoroughly and understood it utterly. Thank you so much, Christine. That was really, really wonderful. There's an interesting phenomenon going on in American publishing right now, and it's what I'll call, for lack of a better term, the ascension of the literary novel. That's been very good for me this season. Right now, if you look at the New York Times bestseller list, you have amidst the more popular offerings the story of, for example, A Female Haven Under Fire, written by the first black woman to become a Nobel laureate, a novel called Paradise. You have a lyrical first novel about a man leaving the Civil War battlefields to journey home to his wife, a novel called Cold Mountain. And you have another first novel that's been on the list for, going on a year now almost, by a young Jewish man writing in the voice of a first-person voice of a Japanese geisha. There's another interesting phenomenon in literary fiction. This one can be summed up in a single word, and that word is Oprah. As I learned last week when she chose Black and Blue as the newest entry in her TV book club. Astoundingly enough, Oprah Winfrey can make the difference between having 250,000 and 850,000 books in print. She's brought readers to Toni Morrison, to Ernest Gaines, to Jane Hamilton, to Ursula Hedgie, to so many other literary novelists people who otherwise would never have heard of them, much less bought their books and read them. Oprah's book club has helped foment another phenomenon in the United States, and that's the book club boom, the individual book club boom. Hundreds of thousands of Americans now belong to these individual book clubs in groups that are meeting once a month at libraries, in bookstores, or more often than not in one member's home to discuss a book the members have read in the preceding month or so. Book clubs aren't new, but this boom really feels like it's a resurgence, a renaissance, and I think it's been partially behind these hopeful days for literary fiction in the bookstores and on the bestseller lists. I mean, when busy people plan to spend several hours in a month talking over a book, that book will not be a thriller or a Gothic romance. There's simply not enough there to talk about. In the last 6 months, as part of an essay book on reading that I'm finishing up now, I sat in on a half a dozen of those book groups. And they were reading everything from Pride and Prejudice to Anna Karenina, from Wallace Stegner to John Irving to Jane Smiley. It was just extraordinary, but everything that they were reading was very, very serious indeed. The members of those book groups that I visited went very deep in their discussions into character, into conflict, and into theme, and that was good for me too, because some of them were reading Black and Blue. And they were talking about what it was really about, as opposed to what it may appear to be about at first blush when you're just talking about plot description, which of course is deeply reductive, because if it wasn't, Anna Karenina would be a novel about a train accident. The genesis of Black and Blue is that 3 years ago I decided that I wanted to write a novel about identity, an issue which has always really concerned me, particularly in the lives of women. Because I started to wonder who we are at base without our connections to other people, without our loved ones, without the minutiae of our daily lives. What is left if you strip away everything we have? It's part of a rich tradition in American fiction, the kind of picaresque personal recreation. Ann Tyler wrote about it last in Ladder of Years, her last book. You could say that the Tom Sawyer books are the same sort of deal. You become someone different and get to come back and listen to them eulogize you at your own mock funeral. It's often played out in American fiction in trips to sea, to war. Occasionally, it's simply played out in the person of an individual who wakes up one morning, who packs up and disappears. None of those things spoke to me when I thought about writing about identity, writing about somebody who'd had to give up her identity and assume a new one. I've never been to war. I get seasick sometimes. And I don't think people willingly leave a life they've built out of hundreds of tiny pieces. They're mosaic. I certainly don't think women did. And so I decided to explore the issue of identity by creating a character who had to leave her old one behind, a woman who was fleeing an abusive husband. So my novel about identity inevitably became known as a novel about domestic violence, except for those people who'd really read it and thought about all of it, not just parts of it. And it became thought of that way, I suppose, because of its beginning. And I thought, despite the fact that it might stereotype the book, that I would read that beginning to you tonight. The first time my husband hit me, I was 19 years old. One sentence and I'm lost. One sentence and I can hear his voice in my head, that butterscotch syrup voice that made goosebumps rise on my arms when I was young, that turned all of my skin warm and alive with a sibilant S, the drawling vowels, its shocking fricatives. It always sounded like a whisper, the way he talked, the intimacy of it, the way the words seemed to go into your guts, your head, your heart. Geez, Bob, one of the guys would say, you should have been a radio announcer. You should have done those voiceover things for commercials. It was like a genie wafting purple and smoky from the lamp, Bobby's voice, or perfume when you took the glass stopper out of the bottle. I remember going to court once when Bobby was a witness in a case. It was 11, maybe 12 years ago, before Robert was born, before my collarbone was broken and my nose, which hasn't healed quite right because I said it myself, looking in the bathroom mirror in the middle of the night, petals of adhesive tape fringing the frame. Bobby wanted me to come to court when he was testifying because it was a famous case at the time, although one famous case succeeds another in New York City, the way one pinky gold sunset over the sludge of the Hudson River fades and blooms brand new each night. A 15-year-old boy from Brooklyn was accused of raping a Dominican nun at knife point and then asking her to pray for him. His attorney said it was a lie, that the kid had had no idea that the woman in the aqua double-knit pants and the striped blouse was a nun, that the sex was consensual, although the nun was 62 and paste waxing a floor in a shelter at the time. They took paste wax from the knees of the kid's pants, brought in the paste wax manufacturer to do a chemical comparison. The lawyer was an old guy with a storefront in a bad neighborhood, I remember, and the kid's mother had scraped together the money to hire him because legal aid had sent a black court appointed, and she was convinced that her son needed a white lawyer to win his case. Half blind, hungover, dandruff on the shoulders of his gray suit like a dusting of snow, the kid's attorney was stupid enough to call the kid as a witness and to ask why he had confessed to a crime he hadn't committed. There was this cop in the room, the boy said, real low, his broad forehead tipped toward the microphone, his fingers playing idly with his bottom lip so that his words were a little muffled. He don't ask none of the questions. He just kept hassling me, man. Like he kept saying, tell us what you did, Tyrone. Tell us what you did. It was like he hypnotized me, man. He just kept saying it over and over. I couldn't get away from him. The jury believed that Tyrone Biggs had done the rape, and so did everyone else in New York who read the tabloids, watched the news, So did the judge, who gave him the maximum, 8 to 15 years, and called him a boil in the body of humanity. But I knew that while Tyrone was lying about the rape, he was telling the truth about that police officer, because I lived with that voice every day, had been hypnotized by it myself. I knew what it could do, how it could sound. It went down into your soul like a confessor, like a seducer saying, "Tell me, tell me." "Franny, Franny, Fran," he'd croon, whisper, sing. Sometimes Bobby even made me believe that I was guilty of something, that I was sleeping with every doctor at the hospital, that I made him slip and bang his bad knee, that I made him beat me up, that it was me who made the fist, angled the foot, brought down a hand hard. Hard. The first time he hit me, I was 19. I can hear his voice now, so persuasive, so low, and yet somehow so strong, making me understand once again that I'm wrong. "Franny, Franny, Fran," he says. That's how he begins. "Franny, Franny, Fran. The first time I wasn't your husband yet. You were already 20 because it was a weekend after we went to City Island for your birthday. And I didn't hit you. You know I didn't hit you. You see, Fran, this is what you do. You twist things. You always twist things." I can hear him in my head, and I know he's right. He didn't hit me that first time. He just held onto my upper arm so tight that the marks of his fingertips was like a tattoo, a black sun with 4 small moons revolving around it. It was summer, and I couldn't wear a sundress for a week or take off my clothes when my sister Grace was in the room we shared, the one that looked out over the air shaft to the Tarnowski's apartment on the other side. He had done it because I danced with Dee Stemple's brother and then laughed when he challenged me on it. He held me there, he said, so that I couldn't get away, because if I got away, it would be the end of him. He loved me that much. The next night, he pushed back the sleeve of my blouse and kissed each mark, and his tears wet the spots as though to wash the black white again, as white as the rest of my white skin, as though his tears would do what absolution did for venial sins, wash them clean. "Oh, Jesus," he whispered, "I am so goddamn sorry." And I cried too. When I cried in those days, it was always for his pain, not for mine. As rich and persuasive as Bobby Benedetto's voice, that was how full and palpable was his sorrow and regret, and how huge was his rage. It was like a twister cloud. It rose suddenly from nothing into a moving thing that blew the roof off, black and strong. I smell beer, I smell bourbon, I smell sweat, I smell my own fear, rancor and stronger than all three. I smell it now in the vast waiting room of 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. There are long wooden benches, and my son Robert and I have huddled together into the corner of one of them. Across from us slumps a man in the moth-eaten motley of the homeless, who smells of beer and vomit like so many I've seen in the waiting room at the hospital, cooking up symptoms from bad feet to blindness to get a bed for the night and institutional breakfast on a tray. The benches in 30th Street Station are solid, plain, utilitarian, like the pews in St. Stanislaus. The Church of the Holy Pollock, Bobby called St. Stanny's, but he still wanted us to be married there, where he'd been baptized, where his father had been eulogized as a cop's cop. I had never lived in one place long enough to have a real home parish, and I'd agreed. Together we'd placed a rose from my bouquet at the side altar in front of the statue of St. Joseph in memory of Bobby's father. It was the only memory of his father that Bobby ever shared with me. The great vaulted ceiling of the train station arched 4 stories over us, Robert and I, in our one small carry-all bag. Inside only toothbrushes, a change of clothes, some video game cartridges, and a book. A romance novel, stupid, shallow, but I had enough of real life every day to last me forever. Gilded, Majestic, the station was what I believed the courtroom would be like that day I went to court when my husband took the stand. State your name, Robert Anthony Benedetto, and your occupation. I'm a police officer for the city of New York. The courtroom in the state Supreme Court had been nothing at all like 30th Street Station. It was low-ceilinged, dingy, paneled in dark wood that sucked up all the light from low windows that looked out on Police Plaza. It seemed more like a rec room than a courtroom. The train station in Philadelphia looked the way I'd always imagined a courtroom would look, or maybe the way one would look in a dream if you were dreaming you were the judge or the accused. Robert was staring up at the ceiling so high above that those of us scattered around the floor so far below were diminished, almost negated by it. At one end of the huge vaulted room was a black statue of an angel holding a dead or dying man. I thought it was a war memorial, and under normal circumstances I would have walked across to read the inscription on the block beneath the angel's naked toes. But whatever the opposite of normal circumstances was, this was it. I shivered in the air conditioning, dressed for July in a room whose temperature was lowered to April, my mind cold as January. The statue was taller than our little house down the block from the bay in Brooklyn, taller than my in-laws' house or the last building where I'd lived with my parents, the one in Bensonhurst, where, in the crowded little bedroom, I dressed in my wedding gown, snagging the hem of my train on a popped nail in the scuffed floorboards. The sheer heroic thrust of the station made me feel tiny, almost invisible, almost safe, except that my eyes wandered constantly from the double glass doors to the street at one end to the double glass doors to the street at the other, waiting, watching, waiting for Bobby to come through the doors, his hands clenched in his pants pocket, his face the dusky color that flooded it whenever he was angry about anything, which was lots of the time. I'd been waiting for Bobby to come through doors most of my life, waiting and watching to gauge his mood and so my own. A finger of sweat traced my spine and slid into the cleft where my underpants began. The cotton at my crotch was wet, summer sweat and fear. I'd been afraid so many times that I thought I knew exactly what it felt like, but this was something different altogether, like the difference between water and ice. Ice in my belly, in my chest, beneath my breast, between my eyes, as though I'd gulped down a lemonade too quickly in the heat. Brain freeze, Robert and his friends called it when it happened to them, and they'd reel around the kitchen, holding their heads. Wait on the bench by the coffee kiosk, the man had said. He had driven us from New York to Philadelphia in total silence, like a well-trained chauffeur. As we got out of the old Plymouth Volare in front of the train station, he had leaned across the front seat, looking up at me through the open passenger door. He had smelled like English leather, which Bobby had worn when we were both young, before we were married. Bobby had worn it that time when I was 19, the first time, or 20. I guess it was right, Bobby's voice in my head. I guess I just turned 20 that first time. Maybe he was testing me then to see how much I could take. Maybe he did that every time until finally he had decided that I would take anything at all. What? Robert had said, looking up at me as the man in the Volare drove away to wherever he came from, whoever he was. What did he say? Where are we going now? Where are we going? And there was the coffee kiosk, and here was the bench, and here we were, my 10-year-old son and I, waiting for what? Waiting to escape, to get gone, to disappear so that Bobby could never find us. I think Robert knew everything when he saw me that morning, cutting my hair in the medicine cabinet mirror, whispering on the phone, taking off the bandages and throwing them in the trash, putting all the recent photographs in an envelope and addressing it to my sister Grace so that Bobby wouldn't have good pictures to show people when he started to search for us. Where are we going? Robert had asked. On a trip, I'd replied. If Robert had been an ordinary 10-year-old, he would have cajoled and whined, asked and asked and asked until I snapped at him to keep quiet. But he'd never been ordinary. For as long as either of us could remember, he'd been a boy with a secret, and he'd kept it well. He had to have heard the sound of the slaps, the thump of the punches, the bird call of my sobs as I taped myself up, swabbed myself off, put my pieces back together again. He'd seen my bruises after the fact. He'd heard the sharp intakes of breath when he hugged too hard in places I was hurt. But he looked away the way he knew we both wanted him to, my husband for his reasons, me for mine. It was just that last time when he came in from school and I turned at the kitchen counter, his apple slices on a plate, his milk in a glass, my face swollen, misshapen, the colors of a spectacular sunset just before nightfall, my smile a clownish wiggle of a thing because of my split lip, that he couldn't manage to look away, disappear upstairs, pretend he didn't see. "Mom, oh Mom," he'd said, his eyes enormous. "Don't worry," I'd replied before he could say more. "I'll take care of everything." "Mom," he'd said again. And then maybe he remembered the secret, remembered all those mornings after the horrible sounds and screams, how his father would sit at the table drinking coffee from his PBA mug, how I'd come in from running and go up to shower, how everyone acted as though everything was just as it should be. So the wild light in his eyes flared, flickered, died, and he added, "Was it an accident?" Because that's what I'd said year after year. An accident. I had an accident. The accident was that I met Bobby Benedetto in a bar and I fell crazy in love with him. And after that, I fell further and further every year. Not so you'd notice if you knew me, although no one really did. On the outside, I looked fine. The job, the house, the kid, the husband, the smile. Nobody got to see the hitting, which was really the humiliation, which turned into the hatred. Not just hating Bobby, but hating myself, too. The cringing self that was afraid to pick up the remote control from the coffee table in case it was just that thing that set him off. I remember a story in the Daily News a couple of years ago about a guy who kept a woman chained in the basement of the building where he was a custodian. Whenever he felt like it, he went down the concrete steps and did what he wanted to her. Part of me had been in a cellar, too, waiting for the sound of footfalls on the stairs. And I wasn't even chained. I stayed because I thought things would get better, or at least not worse. I stayed because I wanted my son to have a father, and I wanted a home. For a long time, I stayed because I loved Bobby Benedetto, because no one had ever gotten to me the way he did. I think he knew that. He made me his accomplice in what he did, and I made Robert mine. Until that last time when I knew I had to go. When I knew that if I told my son I'd broken my own nose, blacked my eye, split my lip by walking into the dining room door in the dark, that I would have gone past some point of no return. The secret was killing the kid in him and the woman in me, what was left of her. I had to save him and myself. I've gotten asked many questions about the beginning of that book as I've traveled around America and then here too. I've gotten asked whether it's autobiographical, and the answer is thank God that it's not. I've gotten asked about why I decided to write about domestic violence, and the answer is that I didn't initially, but that now that I have in some fashion, and that women who know this issue from personal experience or who have worked with women who have told me that I got something about it just right. It's been enormously gratifying to me. I've been asked whether it wasn't a difficult book to write, and the answer is that in most ways the count it was not. And the reason for that is clear. Because at the moment that this novel begins, Fran Benedetto is, despite the bruises on her face, despite the fact that she's leaving everything behind, despite the terror that's clear here, she is a woman triumphant because she has decided to try to do that hardest thing of all, to save herself and the person she loves best in the whole world, her son Robert, and start a new life from the ground up, something that takes more courage than I think I would ever have. Christine talked about how there's a kind of a theme in some of the pieces about me, about the having it all woman, which I find deeply disturbing because I think those kind of labels exist mainly to make other women feel bad about themselves. I certainly know that it makes me feel bad when I read how effortlessly some other woman holds it all together. And so as I traveled around America, I got asked lots of questions about the so-called secret of my success, such as it is. And one of the things that I've talked about over and over again is that I have had very good timing. I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia and went to a women's college in New York City just at the time when opportunities for women were expanding in the United States beyond my wildest dreams, when my two previous career paths, nun and wife, had expanded to create numerous others. I got to the New York Times at a time not only when they were inclined by virtue of litigation brought against them by some brave women at the paper to hire and promote more women reporters, but also at a time when the newspaper business in America in general, and the New York Times in particular, were changing to suit my particular talents. It was a time when adjectives began to make their way into the paper. And someone who could come up with a simile or a metaphor suddenly became something of value in what had before been only a who, what, when, where, and why world. Sometimes I talk about the scars I bear from the copy desk at the New York Times. I remember in August of 1977, I was a 24-year-old newly hired female reporter at that place, which sometimes refers to itself as the first rough draft of history. And I was asked to do what's called the day story. It's about some particular day of the year. It's sort of the journalistic bottom of the barrel. And I was doing a story about the hottest day of the year in August. And the lead of my story, the first sentence was, hot town, comma, summer in the city, period. And the aged copy editor came back to my desk and said, this is a sentence fragment. And he started to rehearse all the possible ways that we could fix that. It was a hot town, semicolon, the New York Times punctuation mark of choice. It was summer in the city. And I pictured all my friends reading that the next morning, and so finally I said, you can't do that. That's the first line of a rock and roll song. And he didn't even reply. He just gave me this look, and the look said, if she thinks she's getting a sentence fragment, much less a rock and roll song, into this newspaper, she's got another thing coming. And the next day my story ran more or less as I'd written it, except without that first line. And 5 years later, when I was writing the About New York column and August came around, I wrote a column about New York before air conditioning. And the first line was, hot town, comma, summer in the city, and it sailed right through. Good timing. My timing was good when I had these two little baby boys, and I was asked to do a once-a-week column called Life in the 30s, which we made up out of whole cloth. Abe Rosenthal, who was then the executive editor of the New York Times, told me to write about what I was talking about with my friends on the phone. And we had no idea whether anyone would write it, and then it turned out that there were many, many women readers as confused and as torn as I was by all the choices we had and the decisions we had to make, and it developed a real readership. And then when I had a third baby and left and came back on the op-ed page, it turned out that that was good timing for me too, because the conventions of that form were changing, but so was society in which I was writing that column. So that while there are two other women before me who had written on the Times op-ed page, one, Anne O'Hare McCormick, during the Second World War and immediately after, and the other Flora Lewis in the 70s and 80s, both of whom wrote, by the way, about foreign affairs. I became the first columnist in the history of the paper to write in a way that was sort of flagrantly female about being a woman in America because of the changes that feminism had wrought in American culture, and also, and I never forget this, because of the lawsuit those 6 brave women had brought in 1974. And when I came around to this latest book, I realized that my timing was good, even though it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with my publisher and my editor and my agent, because the book was published 3 weeks after the Toni Morrison book hit and 2 months before the new Anne Rice book hit. And so it stayed on the bestseller list for a goodly number of weeks until Oprah did me the biggest favor that anyone's done in my entire literary life. But I look at the new Jane Smiley novel, which has just been published, and the new Jane Hamilton, and the new Ann Tyler, and I think there's so much room for more, because in terms of timing, it's such a great time to be a woman novelist, and a woman novelist who wants to unabashedly write about the home front as a kind of a a microcosm of everything that ever happens in the world. I mean, you look at the bookshelves in any of your bookstores, there are 5 great Alices now alone writing in America. You have Alice Walker, Alice Adams, Alice Hoffman, Alice Munro, and Alice McDermott, who may be the most underappreciated American writer right now, who's an amazing talent. Most in America, I think, of the fiction writing that's freshest and that has the greatest sense of depth and control is being written by women, it seems to me. And most of it is about what we know through long experience, through our friendships with other women, through those phone calls is most important, and that's the terrain of our emotional lives and our psyches as revealed by the events of everyday life. On this book tour, a reporter said to me, "Do you ever think you'll write about anything except family?" And I said, "Is there anything else to write about?" I mean, The Sound and the Fury is a novel about a family. Portnoy's Complaint is a novel about a family. The World According to Garp is a novel about a family. Anna Karenina is a novel about a family, and so is Middlemarch, and so is Lolita. It's not that we're suddenly beginning to write about family, which is really the template in which we learn to cast all of our other relationships. Thank you very much, Dr. Freud, for that Oedipal complex. We understand. It's that now we don't pretend that we're writing about something else. I mean, it always tickles me when I reread Tolstoy that he called War and Peace, because War and Peace it's a book about families. That's all there is to it. I mean, I believe most of what's important in our lives takes place at kitchen tables and in living rooms. I'm never going to write a war novel. I'm never going to write about conquering mountains. The most interesting review that I read during this most recent book tour about my own work was one in the Daily New York Times, where a very smart critic wrote really an essay about the difference in the way men and women approach certain situations. And she said that when men write about peril, they write about huge storms or avalanches, and that when women write about peril, they write about terminal illness and domestic violence and losing children. It was really one of the few reviews of my own work that actively made me think about it in a way that I had never thought about it before. And yet, out on book tour, when I've talked about good timing, one of the things that I can almost feel from the audience is that that's not what they want to hear about. Good timing sounds a little bit too much like luck, when what they want from you once you've written a book is a kind of a formula. You know, you write X number of words in X number of days, and you put it together, and you preheat the oven to 350, and you put it in, and then it bakes, and it rises, and it's published, and so on and so forth. And of course, the problem is that there isn't any formula, or else books wouldn't be as interesting as they are. I mean, you can give people tips for how to move from one newspaper to another, or maybe how to get an agent, but after that, what it all comes down to is writing, and there just isn't any formula for writing, and there's really no formula for good writing. The best you can say is that you put one verb after one noun over and over again. You read what you've written over afterwards, and you delete all the lame stuff. You see pictures in your mind's eye, and you try to make reasonable facsimiles of those pictures through words on the page. One of the other questions that people asked me over and over again was about the difference between writing for newspapers, writing journalism, and writing fiction. And in the beginning, I used to say quite succinctly that there really wasn't much of a difference. And that threw people into a total swivet. I could tell by the noises they made. And then it threw me into a swivet because I realized that I was speaking to some deep suspicion. Because when I was writing in the New York Times, over 25 years in the newspaper business, 17 there, when I was writing about people I actually met and talked to, and places I actually went to and studied, people were always accusing us in the newspaper business of making everything up. Then when I made things up, when I became a novelist, everyone insisted I was merely using a thinly disguised version of the facts of my own life. So that when I talked about there not being much difference, I realized that in the minds of my listeners, the facts were assumed to be fiction, and the fiction was assumed to be fact, which really threw me for a loop. But what I really mean when I say there's not much difference between the two forms has to do with what makes for good writing, and that's good writing of any sort. The very best preparation that I had for my life as a novelist today is my life as a journalist. Because those same things that lift prose off the newsprint of one also lift them off of the page of the other. I mean, I learned as a reporter at a time when suddenly more impressionistic renderings of events were beginning to creep into the paper, to look always for the telling detail. The baseball cap, the shards of broken glass, the striped beach towel on a deserted beach, the neon sign in a club window. I mean, Amsterdam is a city with more telling details than I could even imagine possible before I arrived here. Those things that when you take them incrementally and put them all together, make a kind of a convincing picture of some sort of real life. I learned in the newspaper business to distinguish between those details that simply were and those details that really revealed something. Those are the essence of fiction that feels real. It's why Dickens has always been and remains my favorite writer. I learned from 25 years of writing down what real people said in the pages of my reporter's notebook, how real people talk. I learned that syntax and rhythm could be almost as individual in conversation as a fingerprint, and that one sentence of what someone said precisely transcribed could sometimes delineate a character in a way that 5 pages of exposition could never do. Now, in the newspaper business, we all know of times that we've read quotes, say in the 3rd paragraph of a story, that seem to sum up the entire point of the story, really just perfectly, and thought, that's piped, meaning it's made up, it's concocted. It's just too pat, too flat, too perfect at one level, and too sort of impersonal at another level. That happens in fiction, too, the piped quote, the one that just doesn't seem real. It's the one that doesn't have any edge, any grit, any individuality, that sounds like a speech or a maxim instead of a sentence. I was so proud of my 14-year-old this summer when he finished reading The Fountainhead and came in and said to me, "Why did they let her get all these speeches in this book?" I said, "But honey, the whole point of this book was those speeches for her." And he said, "Some editor should have known better." Well, I mean, I write that kind of dialogue sometimes, but I usually catch it in the rereading, and that is pure and simple because I was a journalist. I also learned in the newspaper business to make every word count. I mean, all those years of having someone at noon say, "Oh, well, you can have 1,200 words to tell this story." And then the same person coming back to me at 3 o'clock and saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, we have breaking news. You can do 900 words on that story." And then the layout comes and you try to put your 900 words in it, and lo and behold, the layout only really holds 750 words. That taught me over the years to make the distinction between the words that were really necessary and illuminating and the words that were the sound of me falling in love with my own voice. I felt as if those words were smooth stones in a pile, and I had to make sure I picked the right combination of the sturdiest, the shiniest, the big ones, and the small ones. I don't have to write to space anymore. I can write 80,000 words. I can write 100,000 words, as some of the most recent American novels might tell you. I could even write 200,000 words if I wanted to. But those old habits die hard, and I would say that of the virtues of my prose that I am most convinced of, the fact that there's not much fat in it is right up there at the top of my list, because the most common shortcoming I find in even fine books I read nowadays is under-editing. And I mean under-editing for the sense of excess and digression. I read lots of very good books that ought to be 50 or 70 or even 100 pages shorter than they are. I do my own cutting, and I learned that in a place and under circumstances that were commonplace, swift, and utterly draconian. I remember reading a quote once that said, it was from Jacques Barzun, and he said, "Convince yourself that you are working in clay, not marble, on paper, not eternal bronze. Let that first sentence be as stupid as it wishes. No one will rush out and print it as it stands. Just put it down, then another. Well, that's the answer when some people on the road have said to me, how do you write a novel? The answer is, convince yourself that you're working in clay. Sit down. Every morning, you sit down and you write until you can't write anymore. Not don't want to, not good enough, just can't. The pictures fade. But that leads to a question which comes to me mainly from print reporters all over America, although no one asked it here. And the question is, how do you make it up? Well, the answer in its broadest form is, I don't know. I mean, I know how I do it logistically, and it starts with character. I create characters who have a birth order in their family, for example. So I know something about how they'll behave. And they have certain kinds of childhood and educational backgrounds, and that tells me more. And they have certain kinds of jobs, which are a key to their character, and they have foibles and fantasies. And you put enough of those things together, and you have a whole person. It's a little like psychotherapy done kind of backwards. And you put enough of those people together and they'll do things, and the things they do is called plot. Besides, the notion of actually making it up becomes a little illusory after a while. I know writers say this and it sounds terribly mystical, and I hate sounding mystical, but if you build characters from the ground up, if you make them really real, your ability to truly invent what they do decreases as their verisimilitude grows. I mean, certain people will only behave in certain ways, and certain behaviors will only lead to certain other behaviors. The entire range of possible events narrows as characters choose one road and not another. I think of it like a perspective drawing, getting narrower and narrower and narrower, until it reaches a fixed point in the distance, and that point is the ending. I remember with this book, some people at my publisher found the ending upsetting. It was not what they wanted, and I had to reply, this is the ending of this book. It is not one of a possible series of endings that I chose. It is the way it ends. Life is like that. Fiction is like life, if it's good and true. To that extent, I know how I make it up. When I say I don't know, what I mean is that I don't know why, despite my background as a writer of fact. I find it fairly simple and straightforward to do so, and yet many of my most gifted colleagues don't. I suppose it's a little like columnizing. I've known wonderful reporters and wonderful writers who somehow couldn't manage to write columns, and I've known people who were at best adequate writers who became spectacular columnists. Sometimes I think there's a kind of a columnist gene that helps you create that kind of persona, the talking voice. Maybe the same is true of novel writing. I don't know. I always wanted to be a novelist. Underneath my high school yearbook picture, it says ambition to write the great American novel. I only went into the newspaper business originally to pay the rent. And then I discovered that it was more fun than I could ever have imagined. And that asking people the kind of questions that a well-brought-up Irish Catholic girl was not supposed to ask them was just too seductive to give up. I never imagined that I would hone my skills so much as a prose stylist doing it. And I didn't realize that being a reporter would make me a better human being simply by exposing me to the everyday courage of ordinary people, which it did over and over again. Being in the newspaper business and journalism isn't usually thought of as a sister to fiction writing, more often a kind of a stepchild, despite the fact that Dickens was a reporter and Walt Whitman was in the newspaper business for much of his life. But being in the newspaper business was the very best thing that ever happened to me. The truth is that I couldn't have had one of these professional lives without the other. There's a tendency still, and I've been guilty of it sometimes, to give hardcovers respect that newsprint never gets. And I know that all of you are here tonight by virtue of being here, respect hardcovers, so I'll make a bid for respectability for my former life. Newspapers, even more than the people who bottle and deliver milk, deal with the most disposable, important product on earth, and yet they scarcely ever deliver it sour, in my opinion. I'm a novelist now, but I wouldn't be one, or at least not as good a one as I like to think I'd become if I hadn't been a newspaper woman first, and I think somewhere in my heart, always. Thank you. Welfare allotment for 3 people, that it makes vivid what that kind of life consists of and how extremely difficult it can be in a way that pieces about welfare reform simply don't. So that when I sat down to write this book, I was confident that if I made the character of Fran real, and I made real what I think are kind of deep needs in her, based on a kind of an emotionally flat childhood, for just the sort of man that Bobby is, someone who generates a kind of extraordinary amount of heat and light. And if I made real Bobby's character and the ways in which he is seductive and charming, and yet ultimately incapable of dealing with disappointment or frustration or aggression, except in the most violent kind of ways, that if I put the two of them together and had them react to one another in the ways that I was confident, given my understanding of their characters, that would have a kind of verisimilitude that would speak to the issue in a way that issues don't. And I suppose, a little concerned that if I researched the issue first, knowing something about the kind of typicality of cases would make me flatten out my characters in a way that would be uninteresting to me from a fiction writer's point of view, and that would ultimately not serve the reader. And so one of the most gratifying parts of going on book tour around America has been having people who work with women who have been beaten by their boyfriends or husbands or significant others come up to me and say, "Boy, did you get it right." And one of the things that they think I got right, and one of the things that I'm very happy about, is that in lots of ways that matter, Fran doesn't feel like a victim. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that I think that we've created a kind of a victim culture to insulate ourselves from bad things. If we think of a certain group of people as victims, what we're essentially doing is making them not like us in ways that make us feel safe. If you think of a victim of domestic violence as someone who is weak and lets this happen to her, or someone who is downtrodden, or someone who is too stupid to get out of a bad situation, then you can convince yourself that this couldn't be happening to your best friend, or silently to your sister-in-law or your sister, or that it couldn't someday happen to you. When in fact the truth is that it happens with so much frequency under such a cloak of secrecy and shame, that there's all kinds of women who find themselves in this situation. And one of the things that I liked about Fran was that I think she's very smart and strong and capable. She just has this kind of blind spot and this silent place in her life. And people who are involved in Alcoholics Anonymous have this metaphor that they use. It's called the elephant in the living room, and it refers to the drinking of someone in your household, that there's this elephant in the living room and everyone pretends it's not there and tiptoes around it because you don't want to bother the elephant, because then you might have to acknowledge it and it might start to rampage around. And I think that that's what this is for Fran, that if we all just tiptoe around it and we pretend it's not there for a certain amount of time, then somehow everything will be all right. So that I didn't do any research, but I'm so happy to find out that if you make people real and think think seriously about this situation, that you can recreate what it's like for some of the women who have unfortunately experienced it.
I was wondering, is Fran sexually attracted to Bobby? Is it a sexual thing?
I think it's a huge part of it, and one of the things that I wanted to make vivid in this book is the extent to which sometimes women... One of the peculiar things about marriage is that we first become romantically attracted to people at a moment in our lives when we are utterly governed by our hormones. In other words, the first time that we think we're in love, we're maybe 15 or 16 years old, and so much of it is about sex. I mean, 99% of it is. It's all, that sort of thing. And that's the kind of laboratory in which we learn to find love relationships. Now, what happens increasingly now that people are putting off serious commitments or marriage until they're older is that people mature past that and realize the virtues of companionship and friendship and having something in common. But the truth is that for many women, that kind of what we call chemistry, that kind of physical attraction, governs much of what they find in a love relationship. And there is a certain kind of woman who's constantly drawn to what I would characterize as bad boys in some way or another. The nicest man in the world might fall in love with her and it won't make any difference. And Fran has some of that going on here.
Are they still having sex later on, or good sex? I mean, he's obviously sort of taking her, but it's something I was wondering about.
I think they're having forced sex by the end. I don't think.
No, but she's no longer enjoying it.
No, I don't think. But that sexual fascination that he has for her is transmuted into the kind of fascination that you have watching a cobra in a basket or something. That kind of, she understands his power in a different way, but she still understands it.
These women fall for bad boys, just like Ellen in One True Thing falls for John. Now, there seems to be a pattern in both books where first they have this awful man, this bastard, and then comes along a nice guy like Mike, and he's nice, but he's slightly boring. And the thing is, Ellen does get married to him in the end, but it is Fran gets married to him, but there's little passion, it seems, and it's so sad in a sense, because I had a feeling as I read it that part of her still longs for the bad boy, but she settles for the nice guy. And here is Mike, and he's doing the shopping, and he's being so attentive and supportive and kind, and part of her finds him a bit tedious and boring. And it happens also in One True Thing.
And it happens in life, I think, all the time. I do think it happens in life. I like to think...
So it doesn't pay to be nice?
I like to think... Well, no, not with a certain kind of woman. I like to think that Fran is going to learn to appreciate Mike more than she does at the beginning.
With a lot of effort, she will.
I really do. Well, and with some maturity and some distance. But there is that kind of... there's that one moment where one of the nurses on her ER rotation sees Bobby and refers to him as tasty but dangerous. And I do think that for an awful lot of women, there's this kind of draw of that kind of man. I don't think Ellen Golden in One True Thing will ever really have a healthy relationship with a man. I think she's learned to have more of a healthy relationship with herself, but I think her relationship with her father has so marked her that it will always be that kind of dance of approach avoidance that she learned from George. But I think Fran is a more grounded person who is more capable of a kind of gender evolution than Ellen is, and that she really will learn to be happy with Mike and her new family, except that she has a kind of a loss in her life that marks her.
I'm going to put a very indiscreet question to you, but I take it that you're
Am I
used
one
to
of those people?
Now, the thing is that, having read all these interviews and articles about you, I have the feeling that you have a very nice and kind and more or less perfect husband. And there is actually There is a question here, very sweet question. It says, is your husband cute?
I can answer that question absolutely honestly. My husband is incredibly cute. And what's more, in the most irritating sort of way, he's 45, the same age as I am. He looks about 25. He still fits into the tuxedo that he wore the day we were married 20 years ago. But I once wrote what became a kind of a famous column of mine when I was doing a column called Life in the 30s. And it was a column called Husbands and Boyfriends. And it was about how you were either a woman who was drawn to the husband type or you were drawn to the boyfriend type. And to delineate what those two types were, I evoked two of my favorite men, Ashley Wilkes and Rhett Butler. Ashley Wilkes is a husband, good. Rhett Butler is a boyfriend. Now, let's see if you get this. Bill Clinton is a? Al Gore is a? Very good. You're all excellent learners. And I